So I got around to the villains of the Bible thing again, villains of the Bible part 2. It's like we started out with the serpent, and I don't know if you can tell, but I went into this free images program and I typed in Jezebel, and this is what comes up. I mean, really? But I was like, well, it's a woman, so sure. But anyway, I was contemplating about who are the most egregious villains of the Bible, and she definitely, floated up in my mind as being one of them, and a good second person to discuss. And I think she's a good example of what we should not do in our own life, right? We can learn a lot from her mistakes. And that's something that Paul tells us too, right? That these things happened so that you wouldn't do the same things that they did, right? And she makes a number of errors that we can really learn a lot from. Well, she's probably one of the most infamous villains of the Bible. Not only is she the main antagonist opposing one of Israel's greatest prophets, Elijah, but she's also compared to the false prophetess for her wickedness by none other than Jesus himself. So he compares this woman to her and to make an illustration of how wicked this lady is, right? So in Revelation 2:20 he says, "But I have this against you," and it's the church in Thyatira, "that you tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and she teaches and leads my bondservants astray so that they commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols." So even, when you're thinking of villains of the Bible, Jesus names Jezebel as one of those main villains in the Bible. So we're going to look at why Jezebel is such an affront to God and the Bible in an effort to not repeat those same mistakes ourselves. But before we do that, we should take a little bit of time to discuss her a little bit in a historical sense, like who is she, where she come from, that kind of thing. Jezebel is a Phoenician princess. In the Bible, they call her a Sidonian. It's because that's where the city is that the Phoenicians come from. Tyre and Sidon are the two main cities in the Bible. And she's the daughter of King Ethbaal. According to tradition and the ancient historian Josephus, Jezebel was the great aunt of Dido. And that's of some significance because Dido would become the first ruler and queen of the city of Carthage. And if you know anything about ancient history, the Carthaginians were the main rivals to the Roman Empire as they were ascending to power. The Romans had to deal with the Carthaginians. And Hannibal, whom the Romans really were afraid of, was a Carthaginian, and by proxy also kind of a Phoenician as well, because there was a close ties between Tyre and Sidon and Carthage. So just a little interesting factoid there. But Jezebel, being a Phoenician, would have been part of the wider world of Canaanite tribes. That's right, Phoenicians are Canaanites. They are a Canaanite tribe. And being part of the Canaanite peoples means that she was a worshiper of Baal, of course, right? And some historians believe that Jezebel's name is actually altered, that it's actually Jezbaal. And what happens is, if you have to say someone's name a whole bunch of times in the Bible, a lot of times Jewish writers, people who wrote her name down, would purposely alter her spelling of her name so that they didn't have to keep writing Baal down. Or when you read it out loud, they wouldn't have to keep saying Baal's name over and over again because they found it offensive even to say it, It's kind of like when you say something and it just tastes dirty in your mouth, they just didn't like that. So most people think that her actual name might have been something along the lines of Jezbaal, be that as it may. Jezebel was not just any old Baal worshiper. She, being a princess and a queen, was most likely a priestess as well. In Canaanite tradition, it would have been typical for the queen to become a priestess of Astarte or Ishtar, or as is written in the Bible, the Asherah pole. You see that over and over again, and like this reference in the Bible over and over again as the Baal and his Asherah, his consort lady person. So this false religion, though, this Baal worship, this being a high priestess of the Asherah, is the first issue with Jezebel. That's one of the first issues that God is going to have with Jezebel. The promotion of Baal worship among the people of Israel is not only offensive to God, but it violates 2 commandments, right? There we go. Exodus 23 through 5, it says, "You shall have no other gods before me," right? And if you're worshiping Baal, guess what? You're violating that. "And you shall not make for yourself an idol." That's what an Asherah pole is an idol, right? "Or any likeness of what is in heaven or on the earth or beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me." You know anything about what happens with Jezebel and Ahab, his line gets destroyed, and a new line comes up after them, after Ahab's son. Because believe it or not, Ahab actually repented of something in this whole thing. And so the line goes to his son, but then after that it gets destroyed. So Jesus equates the works of the false prophetess that he is talking about in Revelation 2:20 with Jezebel's false religion of Baal worship, right? This false priestess, prophetess in Thyatira, saying that this false prophetess was leading his people away into sexual immorality and the eating of things sacrificed to idols. And I know we talked about this some this morning in class too, that things that were sacrificed to idols in and of themselves might not necessarily be that big of an issue, right? Like when you read in Romans about Paul saying it doesn't matter if you eat it or not, but you should do what your conscience tells you to do, and so on and so forth. Well, this is different. This is about engaging in the evil activities in which the sacrifice meat is consumed during a festival. Okay, so you have like this festival of a pagan god or goddess, and you eat, drink, and be merry, and engage in all kinds of immoral acts with lots of other people, and that is what's going on. And you know that because he first brings up the fact that there is sexual immorality first, and then also the eating of meat sacrificed to idols. Those 2 things are together. Okay, so that's what makes it different than when Paul's talking about it. Paul is talking about the leftovers. Okay, so you eat this and have all these illicit relationships in this festival, and they did that. But then afterwards there was leftovers, and they would go into the meat markets and sell this stuff for cheap because it had to be sold right away. It was all butchered and ready to go, and it would be a good way to get like a cheap piece of meat. But it happened to be part of this festival like the day before kind of thing. So that's a different animal, right? So that's what Paul's talking about. But anyway, I digress. So how does this apply to us? We don't really worship other gods the way they did in the past, do we? Do we really do that now? Do we, there's no like Baal worship place anywhere, is there? I don't know about any. But in a way we do, okay? In a way we do repeat this in our life. Anytime we put something before God, we are placing it on a pedestal and we're giving it a priority in our lives. And in a sense, that is a type of idol worship. And Jesus really makes a statement about this as well when he talks about how money can fill the role of a master over us, or like an idol, or like a god little g to us, right? He says in Matthew 6:24, he says, "No one can serve 2 masters, for either you hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The word is mammon there, and it means riches, accumulation of riches or wealth or something of that nature. So Jesus calls wealth or riches a master that can occupy the same place in one's devotion as should be reserved for God, right? And I don't think it's a stretch to extrapolate that all sin in a person's life can fill that idolatrous position in their life, right? I don't think that's that big of a stretch. Think about people that might be addicted to a lot of these drugs, right? Especially something like heroin or fentanyl, where they'll give everything that they have just to get a little bit more of it, just to get their next high, you know? A lot of the crime in New Hampshire is driven heavily by the fact that per capita, it's one of the highest states for heroin and fentanyl use per capita, and thus drives lots of theft and stealing and crime, like petty crime like that. So it really can dictate and drive people to do things that are absolutely atrocious and horrible. I remember when I was an investigator, somebody would be addicted to heroin, and they would lose their apartment or whatever it is where their living arrangement was, and they would move in with like their grandparents, and they would steal the pills out of their grandparents' cabinet, and like OxyContin or something like that they might have. Either that, or they would steal all their grandparents' tools and sell them to pawn shops so that they could buy more drugs. It's horrible. Can you imagine stealing like your grandfather's, prize saw or whatever to some pawn shop somewhere just so you can get a few bucks to get a couple of pills? I mean, it's terrible, but they don't think about anything but the next high. There is nothing in their mind, their brain, anything other than that. It's amazing how people will betray the ones that they love and give up the ones that they love and trample them down just for something that they just want or think that they need. It's amazing, but it does it to almost everybody that gets addicted to it. It takes them over. It turns them into a totally different person. They're not even rational anymore. It's pretty amazing. So in a way, there is still idol worship, isn't there? It's still happening even now. And we live in a very materialistic, self-absorbed society. And in a lot of ways, that is a type of idol worship. So when we don't submit fully to God, when even a small part of us lives in that rebellion of our sin, we're ultimately devoting ourselves to ourselves, to our own desires, instead of devoting ourselves to God. And that's really being guilty of idolatry, if we think about it. That's what he means when he says you cannot serve two masters. So another thing that Jezebel does is that brings God's wrath is that she marries the Israelite king Ahab. You could say this was more Ahab's sin because he should have known better. But anyway, nonetheless, it was a sin for the two of them to get married in the first place. It says in Exodus 34:11 through 16, it says, "Be sure to comply with what I am commanding you this day. Behold, I am going to drive out the Amorite from you and the Canaanite." And you remember, she's a Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. "Be careful that you do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you are going, or it will become a snare in your midst. But rather you are to tear down their altars and smash their memorial stones and cut down their Asherim." Remember we talked about the Asherah, right? That she would have been like maybe a priestess of. "For you shall not worship any other god, because the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Otherwise you might make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they would prostitute themselves with their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and someone might invite you to eat of his sacrifice. And you might take some of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters might prostitute themselves with their gods and cause your sons also to prostitute themselves with their gods." Right? And then if we go over to Deuteronomy 7:3 and 4, it says, "Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons. You shall not take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me, and they will serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you." So, bad idea to intermarry with the unbeliever, non-believers, false believers, whatever you want to call them. The idol worshipers, right? So there's a long and repeated theme that consistently warns people throughout the Old Testament, right? not to marry Canaanites or any other people other than the people of God, right? That they should be sticking together. The Apostle Paul sums up the reason for this, and an obvious reason. I mean, we can read all these Old Testament verses too, right? Because you end up going and worshiping false pagan gods if you marry into a false pagan god household. But Paul sums it up pretty well when he says in 1 Corinthians 15:33, he says, "Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals." Pretty straightforward, right? If you hitch yourself to a sinner, you're going to probably become a sinner yourself. That's essentially what the logic is there in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So Jezebel's association with Ahab and her corrupt and evil lifestyle stand as an affront to God and his commandments. And similarly, when we become closely associated with an unbeliever, we risk becoming corrupted ourselves. It's always a danger, right? This certainly happened with Ahab as he built palaces and places for worship of the Baal and the Asherah, and allowed Jezebel to do her thing, right? To spread her profane faith throughout all the land. So Jezebel, though, isn't content to stop there. You know, Jezebel is an egregious villain of the Bible. She isn't content to just worship her own gods. She also advocates for them. She's an evangelist of Baal and the Asherah. And she's also a persecutor of the people of God, right? So if you look at 1 Kings 18:4, it says, "For when Jezebel destroyed the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave and provided them with bread and water." She was trying to kill or wipe out God's people. You think that would make God a little bit upset? The equivalent to what would be in the New Testament period is a persecution and killing of Christians. The Romans tried to get them several times throughout history, the Roman Empire, to renounce their faith, to give up their faith in Jesus. And they wouldn't they would torture them, kill them, try to just get them to recant. Now, the same kind of thing is true of Jezebel. She wants them all to worship Baal. She doesn't want anybody worshiping God. 1 Kings 19:1 and 2 says, "Now Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done," and Elijah is a very famous story in the Bible. Elijah and the prophets of Baal each come with a sacrifice to see whose God is more powerful. And Elijah says to wet the carcass with all this precious water, because it hasn't rained for 3.5 years. And they say, "Okay, now have your God consume it." And the prophets of Baal are out there cutting themselves and doing all kinds of crazy things, and nothing will happen. And then Elijah prays, and the fire comes down from heaven, and God blows up the sacrifice. You just imagine this heavenly meteor blast, coming down and just nuking this little animal. And then everybody just kills all the prophets of Baal after that. And she's not happy about that, let me tell you. So it says in 1 Kings 19:1 and 2, "Now Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done and how he killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, 'So may the gods do to me and more so, if by about this time tomorrow I do not make your life like the life of one of them.'" So she threatened to kill him, and actually he runs for it. He goes off into the wilderness and takes off because he doesn't want to get killed by Jezebel. So she's a persecutor of God's people. And being a persecutor of God's people carries along with it a strong condemnation, to be sure. And I think in the New Testament, if I kind of translate this into the New Testament, I like to think about what it says in Romans 1:28 through 32 about Paul when he talks about these people that do evil things and heartily egg one another on to do wickedness, right? It says, "Just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wicked, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips and slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, They not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. And I think that fits Jezebel to a T, don't you? Gives hearty approval to those who practice them. Well, Jezebel's final glaring sin is one that caused her death warrant. It was a sin of greed, envy, and covetousness. Ahab had desired this vineyard owned by a man named Naboth because it was a vineyard next to his palace, and he was like, I would really like to make my palace look super awesome and have a vegetable garden here and tear down this vineyard and get rid of it. And so he offers Naboth like a fair price for it, or he says, I'll give you a better vineyard somewhere else. And Naboth says, no, this is the land of my ancestors. I belong here and I want to stay here. Thank you very much. And well, Ahab's like, oh man. And then he leaves and he's sulking. And then in the ultimate act of eminent domain, Jezebel goes and writes to the town elders and the counselors of the town and says, frame him for blasphemy and swearing against the king, and then have him stoned to death. And they're like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So that's what happens. They kill Naboth, they frame him for blasphemy, and they stone him outside the city gates. And then Ahab happily skips down to the vineyard and goes and buys it, or picks it up. But anyway, for this offense, God condemned her to be eaten basically by dogs. And that's what happens. So sometimes later, the Syrians defeated Ahab in battle. These are other kinds of people that are in the north as well. They're pretty close to where the Phoenicians are, but they're not Canaanites, they're Syrians. But anyway, they come down, they fight Ahab, they beat him. They also see Jezebel there. She gets dressed in all of her finest, dresses up as impressively as she possibly can, and they say, just throw her out the window, please. And they do, and dogs eat her dead carcass. So that's what happens to Jezebel. That's the end of Jezebel. That's her final thing in the Bible. So Jezebel's 4 major offenses against God were worshiping false gods, putting anything before God is a sin, convincing others to follow her in her sinful worship, persecuting those who are righteous, and being a covetous, envious murderer. So for these things, Jezebel is known as one of the most infamous villains of the Bible. She certainly deserves that title. She's a schemer, she's wicked, she's evil, and she's an example also for all of us to not do the same things that she did. At this time, I will offer an invitation. If there is anyone here that wishes to become a Christian, they need to ask themselves if they believe in the Lord God with all their heart, mind, and soul. They're willing to repent of their sins, turn from their darkness and their evil, and embrace God's light. And they're willing to be baptized in commitment to God. Then God has promised forgiveness of sins, the gift of the Holy Spirit, and of course, the most precious thing of all, eternal life. If that is something on your heart, something that you want to do this evening, then I encourage you to come forward as we stand and we sing our closing song.